All right, let's start. Hello, everyone. Salam, namaste, adab, and welcome to today's event. Today, we are going to hear Professor Ganesh Devi, a very well-known public intellectual, literary scholar, linguist, thinker, activist, who is currently Obay Siddiqui Chair, Professor at the National Center for Biological Sciences, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research. And he will be formally introduced by Ms. Rebecca Box-Roberts, who is a Deputy Director of Events at the Library of Congress here in Washington, D.C. And the concluding remarks will be given by Professor Vinay Lal, Professor of History and Asian American Studies, UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. He's a writer, blogger, cultural critic, and has a lot of interest in Indian history, historiography, and on Indian diaspora, and many other disciplines. So welcome you all, and I now formally invite Ms. Robert to have the introductory remarks, please. Yes, Rebecca.
Good morning. Thank you so much for having me. As was mentioned, I am the Deputy Director of Events at the Library of Congress, so I get to play around with words and language for a living. Until the end of last year, I was curator of programming at Planet Word, which is a new museum here in Washington devoted to words and language. And if you haven't had a chance to visit, I recommend it. It's at the corner of 13th and K Northwest. And it explores sort of the joy and wonder of language in all its forms and all of the powerful and beautiful things you can do with language. And as the curator of programming there, I was always on the lookout for stories of interesting people doing interesting things around the world with linguistics and the way language is constructed and the way language is lost and the way language intersects with all kinds of other disciplines. And so when I first read about Ganesh Devi in the New York Times, I was intrigued because he had taken on this project of astonishing proportions. And I'll let him speak for himself, but what really caught my eye was in the 70s, as a young student, he saw a survey of Indian languages. And, you know, as an American, it's already astonishing that India recognizes 22 languages in its constitution. But this survey recognized 109, 108 by name, and the 109th said all others. And Ganesh Devi knew that all others encompassed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of other languages that were not identified by name. And when you don't name it, you are in danger of losing it. And so he set out on this project of just extraordinary scope. It involved 3,500 people. It ultimately mapped 780 languages, which he published in 51 volumes, you know, something like 35,000 pages of research. And so you can't help but be staggered and impressed by the size of the project. But what I found so wonderfully interesting when I did get the chance to interview Ganesh Devi for Planet Word was that he turned that corner from linguist to activist, because as he was mapping this extraordinary wealth of linguistic riches, he was losing them. He was seeing that he was the last person to document languages and he was racing against time. And what is lost when a language is lost? We at Planet Word certainly took the opinion that language shapes your worldview. It's the way your community constructs how you look at the world. And all of you who are multilingual, I'm certain, are familiar with that idea that you think a little bit differently and you approach the other people you're communicating with a little bit differently, depending on what language you're employing. And so when you lose a language, you lose that unique worldview. And what I found so impressive about Ganesh Devi, which there's lots to be impressed by, right? He's an unbelievably prolific author and editor, hundreds of books to his name. But this notion that he took it on himself to preserve language in order to preserve that unique worldview and to value those worldviews as just as equal and important as the ones that were getting named in official documentation. And so I will turn it over to him because I really very much am intrigued to hear what he has to say. But I really think you all are in for a treat, and thank you so much for including me this morning. And Ganesh Devi, it's lovely to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Hello, good morning to everybody in the United States and in Europe as well. Good evening to all friends who are in India, South Asia. And for those who are in Australia, I wish happy dreams. As a child, I felt amazed at the number of languages that I heard in my neighborhood. As a young man studying literature, I was aware that the National Academy of Literature in India was publishing in about 28 languages. And I thought that was a staggering number. As Rebecca mentioned just a minute ago, while speaking so kindly of me, that the 1961 census of India had listed about 1,652 languages. Now, these are large numbers. Even in the last census of India, 2011, 1,369 mother tongues are listed. Very large numbers. The question is, while one does respect the autonomy of a language, the dignity of a language, and I for one do it immensely, while one does respect those, one also likes to ask the question, sometimes in confusion, sometimes in wonderment, sometimes in simply a failure of analysis. The question one likes to ask is, why is it that India and also South Asia, Asia in general, has such a tremendous diversity of languages? I mean, that question is not challenging the uh, how numerous the languages are. The question is really directed to the recent history of about last 200 years and the rise of the idea of nationalism. To be precise, the question is, while various parts of Asia accepted to be nations, and while the idea of nation, nationality, nationhood, nationalism had the source in a tradition which believed that a nation should be monolingual. So why is it that we accepted the idea of being a nation and yet continue to have so many languages? In a way, it's a futile question because it has happened. In a way, it is a given, and therefore it is a sheer waste of time in raising this question. But I feel attracted to this question again and again. And for very many times, I had tried to find tentative answers for myself to this rather intriguing question. One of the answers which I thought would work for me used to be that, well, there has been a tradition of multilingualism. Well, people feel completely at ease in the midst of so many languages surrounding them. Now, while arriving at that answer, I had before me, to place it before you synoptically, I had before me an overview of the history of our people, our part of the world. And one can, of course, get into the history as a long stretch or a relatively short stretch. Uh, very briefly, when the when the advent of the Sanskrit language became the order of the day about 1500 years before Christ, 3500 years before present, there already were uh, Proto-Dravidic speeches, languages. There were Proto-Assamese or Eastern languages, which later subsequently became Prakrits. There was some form of the Pali language, which in not too distant a future from the date of the first or the second Veda was used very effectively with great philosophical complexity and depth by Gautam Buddha for propounding his view of the world, his relationship with the abstract plane of existence. So there were several languages already when Sanskrit arrived. And in some cases they clashed. In some cases they collaborated and produced a new set of diverse languages. Moving closer to our times, with Panini, 4th century before Christ, 2500 is before present. The attempts at defining grammar were attempts at creating a framework which could justify several languages within that framework. Rather than a grammar of a given language, it was a grammar of how to think, a grammar of several languages at the same time. And Panini was not the first, but it appears came at the end of a line of other grammarians before his time, some of whom he mentions, who had been thinking along these lines. Very obviously, they had encountered several languages. They found it necessary to explain existence of many languages, languages which deserved their attention, their consideration. So there being the presence of several languages is quite evident in the structure of the grammar that Paninian tradition of grammar put forward. Just about a century and 50 years later, when the Mauryan Empire started acquiring might, and while it wanted to communicate to the citizens, a citizen is, it's too early in history to use that term, but the subject, when it wanted to communicate with the praja, the people, the inscriptions used were in many tongues, not one language. But the language used for the inscriptions, Ashokan Mauryan Empire, the Ashokan inscriptions, rock edicts, the language changed according to the area. So the emperor had to acknowledge the existence of many languages. Another 500 years down the line, we have theory of literature in Sanskrit or theory of music in India, such as Sarangdev or Matanga, who spoke of Brahad Deshi. Brahad is many, Deshi is the native. And they knew that in order to define the Indian spectrum of music, it would be necessary to speak of music coming out of many languages. If I take another step, another 400, 500 years, and one can go century by century, but I'm skipping so many centuries in between. When the Bhakti movement emerged in India, at the almost at the beginning of the second millennium after Christ, the impulse of Bhakti, that is humanizing God, questioning the caste structure to some extent, and reducing or the effacing completely the gender distinctions. that impulse for doing these things express itself in many tongues. The languages like from the Indo-Aryan set of languages came Gujarati, and then uh, early forms of Hindi, Audi, Punjabi, Kashmiri. On the eastern side, Bangla, Oriya, uh, Assamese, Assamia, Marathi, and so on. But also in the south, where the language family was different, a similar impulse, though slightly early in time, earlier than in the north, emerged. The impulse was nationwide or continent-wide, from the Sufi tradition to the Alwars of the Tamil Dravidic tradition. The impulse was the same, the drive was the same, the economy uh, of thought, the politics of thought, they were the same. But the languages in which the thought was mentioned were many. Further down in history, when the British encountered Indians for the first time, Indians encountered British for the first time. That was when the East India Company set up its first factory in Surat at the beginning of the 17th century, 1600, 1601. The British land there. And in order to transact with the Gujarati-speaking people from Surat, they accepted to use a set of 5 languages together, as if it was a single spectrum of language. There's that lovely essay in the subaltern studies, the language of the command of the language of command and the command of language. English to Portuguese, Portuguese to Armenian, Armenian to Persian, Persian to Gujarati, and then Gujarati to Persian, back again to English. 5 languages, all packed in a single process or act of communication. I'm not using the term act in its technical philosophical term, but in a popular common sense meaning. So many languages did not disturb people. When we were to gain independence, and the idea of nation was settling down in the consciousness of the people, one of the caution that was sounded in 1920s was to alert the activists moving towards the birth of a new nation, were cautioned that we cannot have a unilingual nation. And so a resolution was adopted to the effect that when India becomes, eventually India becomes independent, it would be a nation with many languages. The spirit of that resolution found its reflection in the Constituent Assembly debates, and subsequently, as a result of those debates, in the 8th schedule of the Constitution of India. If other nations close to India did not have similar kind of schedules for languages, the spirit was similar even there. I have given this very haphazard, sketchy overview of how from time to time people in the subcontinent recognize that many languages exist here, and they acknowledge the need for having those many languages rather than having a single language, or rather than getting into a language-based conflict. And there have been wars, there have been conflicts based on the idea, based on the related to land, related to religion, related to, I hesitate in using the term race, but ethnicity probably. Very rarely except once, that is in the case of the independence of Bangladesh. One finds that very rarely there are wars or major conflicts related to based on the question of language. The general ability of people in that area of the world, a region of the world, to withstand existence of many languages, whether one speaks those language, all of them or not. That ability appears to be, I will not say unique, but remarkable, quite outstanding. The question is why? And so this tentative answer that I had provided to myself initially, that because history of India has multilingualism as a fact, people in India are multilingual, but that amounted to saying nothing. It was a tautology. It was a meaningless evidence that I was providing to myself. I then moved to another another explanation, and that was perhaps in the philosophical makeup of the people there is something which tells them that tolerating existence of many languages, celebrating the existence of many languages, is a civilizational virtue. And towards this tentative answer, I started looking for the histories of philosophy and thought, and I immediately jumped on uh, how various religions that emerge, various theological conceptualizations that emerge in this part of the world had not thought of truth as language bound, but as language transcendent, and how Gautam Buddha, in his very last moments, had told his closest disciple that if he or others like him ever wanted to repeat what Buddha said, they should use their own words and not his words. How word in itself was not the matter, and how the matter inside the word was not conditioned by word. I started looking at the Jain philosophy and found that in the initial, nearly for 250 years after the demise of Mahavir, there was great reluctance in placing on record what he had said. And it is only much later that somewhat reluctantly the words imagined to be spoken by Mahavir started getting recorded. Having done that, how the Jain monks, scholars, philosophers spent centuries in reinterpreting those words very variously, very differently, not in an identical, not in a doctrinaire manner. How diversity of meaning was accommodated in that tradition, and how by doing that a tacit recognition of the fact that truth can be spoken in many languages was built into the essence of the Jaina philosophy. In fact, when Gandhi sang something like Ishwar Allah Tere Naam, he was actually presenting a Jain prayer to the people of India. It did not matter what was there in the name. Uh, but I must also say that in the Vedic thought, in various schools of that thought, except the linguistic philosophy thought, there was a permissiveness, whether it was Shankaracharya, who said, well, if he wanted to speak of Govinda, there could be more than 1,000 names. Or whether it was a philosophy based on not speech but on silence, such as the rasa theory, initiated by Bharata in the 2nd century and kind of completed, perfected by Abhinav Gupta in the 11th century, where silence became the heart of aesthetic expression. There was space for saying the same thing differently, variously. It didn't matter in which language one said those words. Even in the tantric tradition, of which Abhinav Gupta of the 11th century, 10th, 11th century, was a great exponent. The Shaiva Tantrism, where pronunciation itself was the magical meaning that a sentence was to convey. There was laxity and permission to use various kinds of bija mantras. I'll not get into these fields beyond this in the time available. I'm trying to say that as when I was looking at various philosophical traditions in India, I thought that I had found some good answer for this question as to why there are so many languages and why they are tolerated, and therefore a ground is always kept ready for the flourishing of many languages. But after a while, I was not happy with that answer because I thought that just a scrutiny of the philosophical making of the people doesn't yield enough about the making of the people. It does in some part, but there's still more left out. And so I looked at the more material, less abstract answer to the question as to why people speak so many languages, and their linguistics came to my rescue. This was my third attempt at looking at that question. And I decided to take an ethnographic, linguistic, anthropological approach. And in that approach, in order to answer that question, why Indians speak so many languages, I thought I was making very rapid progress because the ancient migration studies reveal, I mean, that people migrated over long distances, and wherever there was enough material support in terms of animals for hunting and fruit or food for eating, or enough warmth for their stay, which was not threatening their existence, they tended to stay there rather than moving on. And in the process, they formed what is known as population knots, KNOTS, where a group of 800 to 900 persons stay put, and therefore they develop a language. The others have moved ahead, and therefore when they form elsewhere at some distance, a long distance, another population knot, they would develop a further a different language, a related and yet a different language. I thought this scenario of migrations in the backdrop of the material resources available for maintenance of population would provide a good explanation. If one were to look at the population statistics in the past through projections or through evidence, and match that statistics against the eco material zones in the country, that would give an answer, not country, but the subcontinent, that would give an answer to why there are so many languages, and those languages being there. And since there were not wars on material resources, people decided to tolerate each other's languages, just as they decided to tolerate what is known as this very intriguing thing called caste or tribe. But then I found that even this answer is not giving away enough in order to argue why there is a greater density of languages in some area and a relatively lesser density of languages in some other area. Whether there were migrations towards areas of energy or material resources, and yet the number of languages in that area had not increased as much as languages which were there in the area where there was a relative lack of material resource. I mean, to give a concrete example, a clearer example, Rajasthan, which has 44 different languages, generally all put under the same blanket of Hindi, erroneously, misleadingly. It was not a very congenial place for forming population knots. In fact, history shows that the Indus civilization declined because of the great climate risk in that area of Kutch and Rajasthan. And yet the number of languages in the area is much larger than the neighboring Madhya Pradesh, which has better forest, better water, better soil. Yet the number of languages I noticed in Madhya Pradesh was relatively the same, or not as much. So I think that typically, in terms of the material resource base, about numerosity of languages had some flaw, some holes in that. Having made these several attempts, I thought I would work backwards, not from other factors to language, but from language to other factors. And so my mind turned to a survey, a review, an assessment of movements which are related to languages. And the most striking, the most glorious, and the most successful example of these movements was the formation of the states post-independence. India had accepted existence of many languages in its constitution. But despite having such a constitution, movements started with Telangana in 1952, and then a very strong militant movement in Punjab for Punjabi, and Maharashtra, Marathi in Maharashtra, similar movement in Karnataka for an all Kannada state, which there existed none before, and so on. And in the mid 50s, the Indian state had to appoint a linguistic state reorganization commission. So languages were dictating to the states in a way which had not happened while the formation of the nation in Italy or Germany had happened. There are very significant differences between these language movements and the beginning of nation in Italy or Germany around the question of language, German language or Italian language or German language. Because these states, 'We're not asking for nationality. They were also not asking for subnationality. Let me explain. These states are not saying that we want a Telugu Desham as a nation or Maharashtra Rashtra as a Marathi nation. They're saying that while we accept that India is a union of states, we would like other languages to be there and have their nations as part of us, but would also like to have our language and state, our language, state, not nation, as a part of us. And that is these two ideas of an absolute linguistic nationalism and linguistic statism together with multilingual nation, they came together. And that's the big difference, which still requires good analysis, good commentary. I'm not aware of a very good commentary on that particular combine of nationalism and subnationalism as the twin threads of the narrative that India decided to construct for ourselves. When I started looking at these movements, it occurred to me, of course, it occurred to me only as a hypothesis. And it will need a further fleshing out, it will need a great closer scrutiny and a lot of questioning and cross-questioning in order to weed out the weak positions in that. But when I was looking at these movements, it occurred to me that it is not the Indian attitude towards language that needs to be understood in order to know why India speaks in so many languages, speaks so many languages. And when I say India, perhaps I should extend it to all the way to Syria, Turkey, Iran, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and so on. So the question is the attitude to the state in India is a linguistic attitude? Or is it the attitude to a language that is a statist attitude? These two questions need to be weighed sufficiently. And I felt, by way of hypothesis, I'm proposing this, that the understanding of the abstract, that is theological understanding, the understanding of the metaphysical, the understanding of the not the phenomenal world, but the world which claims to transcend, or which is outside the catchment of the phenomenal world. The attitude to that also is a lingual attitude, linguistic attitude. I'm saying that it is not as if religious metaphysics, theologies guide our attitude to language. I'm saying exactly the opposite. I'm saying our attitude to language guides our attitude to what is metaphysical, what is transcendental. And almost in the same way, I shall avoid using the adventurous term almost in identical way, but almost in a similar way, our attitude to state is a linguistic attitude rather than attitude to language is a statist attitude. Nationalism, where language dictates what nation is qualitatively very different from nationalism, where nation dictates what language is. I shall now turn in order to, that is, in very broad terms, my very crude hypothesis is that India is a linguistic civilization. Not as it has been misunderstood all along in history, intellectual history of last few hundred years, as a metaphysical or non-material civilization. I mean, all of us know that that is. I will not use the term rubbish, but that's not tenable really. It's too romantic, too idealistic, too non-possible positions. India is a linguistic civilization, I'm saying, and it is language as much central as God or religion, or as state and power or empire or nation. To that end, I will add one observation and then conclude what I had to say. That observation is, despite having a range of thinkers, and they're not of any lesser talent than Greek thinkers or Arab thinkers, despite having developed some sciences and a reasoning of reason or logic, having developed a peculiar logic, why is it that Indians did not really put their teeth around the question of what matters, what is matter? Why is it that the probably the most iconic deposition, philosophical contribution that we made was of zero, a non-existence, blankness, things not being there. I will not use the terms like Maya and illusion, because I do not want to either valorize them or begin a debate about them. But as a philosophical concept, zero, which is not a place name, but an abstraction. Why ground that scientific notion of absence? Indians also developed in the past the idea that substance is not as real as the substance not being there, as against the Greek idea that substance is perhaps in a tense relationship with its shadow, that there is a clash between the two, there is a negation of the one by the other. Why on this side there is a great ease in thinking of substance and the shadow at the same time, as if the two had essence which is shared or the same. I am bringing this question for your consideration for the following reason. And that reason is, in semantics, one has always, going by historical linguistics and the way linguistics develops, even structural linguistics, the semantic theory always thinks that there is meaning, while perhaps the basis on which languages work is not the words, but the gaps between the words, the silences, the non-words not being there. And those gaps, those silences, those words not being there bring the meaning together, brings meaning together. That is, zero as a foundation of substance and shadow bringing substance and shadow together. Now, let me extend this rather strange hypothesis I'm bringing to you by adding that as I used to imagine earlier, zero had a certain value. Zero had a certain value, whatever it is, abstract or whatever. I was somewhat pleasantly surprised to find that there were several versions of zero in traditions. One was shunya, which is vacuous, empty. There's nothing inside. There was another called purna, or which was filled with things, but they were eternal or immortal. They were not dying. If you took things out, it would still remain the same value, same payload. If you multiplied that by something, it was zero, and so on. There is a third one, and that is kha, and that is a word used for the skies within which we are. That is a zero in which substances, things are, both life and death are there inside. And it is this kha that actually moved closest to the idea of zero as a mathematical abstraction. In simple words in my language, such as Marathi, ek, dashaka, shataka, sahasraka. So that ka is the number. Beyond that, a higher order of kha begins, as in kharga, etc. That is related to ka, kha, ga, gha, the phonetic subclass of phonetics. I'm saying that India, as a linguistic civilization, has determined people's attitude to the state or powers that be. That's what made Ashoka inscribe his messages, edicts in many languages. That is what made people in India, politicians and the Constituent Assembly in India to go for a list of languages as languages of India. Now, this 8th schedule of Indian languages is a very strange thing. It included Sanskrit, which was a dead language. It included Urdu somewhat unwillingly, while it was the most throbbing and living language. It included Sindhi, while it was a very significant language, but for the Indian context of that time, it was becoming somewhat marginal. That is, this 8th schedule shows the attitude in the subcontinent to languages, and that attitude is that languages are neither large or small, great or little. You remember, that discussion of great tradition and little tradition, 40 years old discussion. Languages are neither great nor small. They're not large or little. They're not central or marginal. And in that sense, languages in India are not languages as bodies, but language as a behavior, a culture, a seamless mental territory of semantic transactions. Languages are not dialects or languages. Language A is not so different from other languages. Linguists have started using linguistic language area, India as language area. We not had enough discussion on that, and that concept is not fully explained yet. There's something peculiar about language behavior in this part of the world. And while I'm not commenting on any particular language, a friend actually mentioned to me just now that I should comment on Urdu. But I'm speaking, when I speak of Tamil or Malayalam, Marathi, I speak of Urdu or Punjabi or Kashmiri or Bengali. It is the language, L capital, language in general, that is my interest. India as a linguistic civilization has taught people in the subcontinent to define the state as dictated by language, define the otherworldly as dictated by language, rather than language being dictated by what nation is and what God is. I am aware that the kind of hypothesis I'm putting forward won't be very popular at this juncture. And I do not have any vanity to imagine that it may someday become very popular and acceptable. But I am still making this effort to put forward the hypothesis because indeed in my observation of the language multiplicity, in the presence of numerous languages in the country, we owe to the languages of this country, of this subcontinent, of entire Asia as such, we owe to them an explanation as to why they have remained so many and yet so central to our being who we are. Why we have been a linguistic civilization or linguistic civilizations, if you like. Thank you. I stop there.
Thank you, Professor Devi. It was really very intellectually inspiring talk. And now, before we go to question and answer, we invite Professor Vinay Lal for the concluding remarks. Professor Vinay.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Let me begin by saying that Professor Devi has, as he has always done, surprised me. Not by the complexity of his presentation, because I quite expected that, but by the thesis he has put forward. I also perhaps had thought that he might be speaking about what we might describe as the politics of language in India today, given the title of the talk, but he has, in fact, actually spoken in a way to the present condition by going back to a certain past and to trying to understand the relationship of language to the making of us as a people. So let me begin with the following observations. But I want to preface that by saying that it would take me some time to digest some of the arguments that he has put forward. So I'm really just obviously thinking aloud and thinking on my feet here. He begins with an intriguing question. That's not the question with which people ordinarily begin when they think about the linguistic situation in India, because the linguistic situation in India is taken as something, as a given, that we have so many languages, we have hundreds of languages, and then there are the kinds of questions that follow that, well, how do we arrest the loss of languages? Because there is obviously loss here, not just in India, but in many other parts of the world, Indonesia being another example of that. But what's intriguing is not that what's intriguing is that he doesn't take this as granted. He asks, why are there so many languages? Why are they tolerated? And in answering these questions, he puts forward the argument that we should really be viewing India as a linguistic civilization rather than as, for example, to take the terms of the present debate, rather than as, for example, a Vedic civilization, which might be the argument, let's say, of certain kinds of Hindu nationalists, right? Or people who take pride in what might be called Indian civilization. There'll be others who will speak not so much of as a Vedic civilization, but of India as a kind of certainly large parts of India as a kind of an Indo-Islamic civilization. So those who think highly of the whole argument about the Ganga Jamuna Tehzeeb, for example, will obviously not go along with the argument of India as a Vedic civilization. Professor Devi in his talk takes us on a very different kind of trajectory and a very intriguing trajectory. Now, in listening to him, I was reminded, curiously enough, I don't know if he had ever really thought of it in this way, but I was reminded actually of an essay written in 1881 by Ernest Renan, an essay that subsequently became exceedingly famous and is still taught. I teach it in my graduate seminars, for example. It's an essay called "What is a Nation?" What is a nation? 1881 or thereabouts. And what Ernest Renan does is he says that, look, a nation, some people say that nation is a group of people who share a common language. And then what he does is he attempts to falsify that, because he says that, well, you take English is spoken by people in the United States and Australia and Canada, New Zealand, England, of course. But there are 5 different nation states here, right? So then he says, well, we can imagine that some people will say that nation is a group of people who share a common religion. But fact of the matter is that there are 40 countries or 50 countries that are Muslim majority countries. There are 30 countries that are predominantly Christian in tenor. But then why are there so many nation states where Christianity? Why isn't it all one nation state, right? And there is, of course, a distinction between a nation and a nation state, which we'll come to in just a moment. But what he does is and then he says, well, maybe a nation is a group of people who share a common past or share common memories, right? So his manner of proceeding here is to take things like language, religion, shared past, common memories, certain maybe ethnic affiliation, and then more or less falsify each hypothesis. And what Professor Devi does in his talk is to say that, look, in answering this question, why are there so many languages, he then, in a sense, offers a kind of a personal intellectual odyssey where he says, at first I thought we may be able to understand something of this if we start to look at bhakti, or we start to look at, for example, what was the flow of ideas and the languages at work at the time of the Buddha and Mahavir. And then he moves to bhakti, and then he says that, well, let's possibly think of an argument which would take into account material resources. And that's what brings him to the whole argument about population knots. But there he says that, well, then if you look at the case of Rajasthan, so where you find 44 languages, and you find that over there, this is a place that is not really congenial for so many population knots. That is that this is not a place which had a kind of a abundance of material resources which might help explain, right, why so many languages developed. And then he contrasts it with Madhya Pradesh, with their neighboring MP, which is more material, which is richer in material resources, but has a fewer number of languages. So thereby he has now suggested that even this kind of argument is really inadequate. And that leads him then, therefore, to this idea that in order to understand India as a linguistic civilization, he says that he, in a sense, got an inspiration from looking at what happened in the post-1947 era when the Linguistic State Reorganization Commission was organized. And there, of course, the question here has to do with what is a particular relationship between languages that, unlike the case of Germany or Italy. In fact, I would have taken what I would call even a stronger case, and that is a case of France. There's a beautiful book by Eugene Weber, Peasants Turned into Frenchmen, which is a book basically which suggests that, look, if you look at modern France, actually the dominant language was Breton in the early 19th century. And what Eugene Weber argues is that in the making of a nation is in some ways a very bloody process. You have to bludgeon people into, as it were, becoming homogenized. One of the ways in which homogenization works is, of course, forcing a language down people's throats. So what is now France is French dominant, right? French speaking, dominance of the French speaking people, but this is a process which illustrates how the nation, as it were, precedes the language. And he's saying that in the case of India, in the post-colonial period, when we look at the Linguistic State Reorganization Committee, essentially, we started with the language, that languages then dictate the state. All right, languages dictate what kind of states emerge. And in this case, we're speaking about states within the Union of India, but each of these states could, in a manner of speaking, have been a nation state almost. Right. So this is the the argument that he is giving here, which an argument which is about the attitude of Indian people to the state is a critical argument, and the attitude towards languages. And this is where I think that I would have to reflect on this argument for a substantial period of time, and I'd have to sort of get a fuller sense from Professor Devi of how one is going to think about both the linguistic attitude and what we might call the statist attitude. Now, just a couple more thoughts very, very quickly, and then I will conclude because I know that I've been given about 8 minutes here. First, and my second comment will be very different, but the first set of comment is that I'd like to ask Professor Devi how he might locate this argument he's putting forward to something like, as an illustration, Ramanujan's essay, his famous essay by A.K. Ramanujan on, is there an Indian way of thinking? Because it appears to me that what in fact Professor Devi is outlining today is actually another stab at this question. When he's putting forward an argument that we should be thinking of India as a linguistic civilization, that if we think of India as a linguistic civilization, this is what has determined the people's attitude to the state. My question, of course, would be, why presume the importance of the state in such a degree? That is that the linguistic attitude determines a great many things. So when we look, for example, at A.K. Ramanujan essays, the state is nowhere there, right? And Ramanujan does speak about India as a house of languages in a way. In fact, he begins his very famous essay by talking about how in the multi-leveled home that he spoke, it was one level was Tamil, the other level was Kannada, and so on, right? With the men, always one language was spoken, with the women, another language was spoken, etc. So does the linguist, if India is a linguistic civilization, is it the case that our attitude towards languages also determines a relationship, not just to the state, but to what one might describe as civil society, right, at large? And I think his interest, his discussion here of the 8th schedule to the Constitution, where he points out that the position that is adopted, in fact, is very distinct in a way, and I would say very ecumenical in that sense, actually, not a word that he used, but I think he certainly has it in mind, because the attitude there was that we should really think of languages neither as great nor small, large or little, central or marginal, and so on, but rather that we should think of them as indicative of certain kinds of cultural attitudes and behavior. And that is what really determines, in a sense, how we think about these languages. And then the second final and second set of comments, or second question in a way for Professor Devi is this, that look, I mean, I think that there is a tendency sometimes to think of a civilization in a certain set of categories. And I want to ask him really as a provocation, whether there is a certain kind of reductionism in a way of thinking of India as a linguistic civilization. Surely we want to think of India as a civilization in many different languages, right? And here I was now reminded of something very different. I was reminded, particularly because of his discussion of zero and his discussion of substance and shadow, I was reminded of an extraordinary little book. It's only 40 pages, but it has more interesting insights than books that are 10 times as long. It's a book by the Japanese writer Tanizaki. It's called In Praise of Shadows, where he says, he puts forward an argument about Japanese civilization, much in the way in which Professor Devi is putting forward an argument about Indian civilization. And the argument there in Tanizaki is that Japanese civilization is in fact a civilization that is largely a civilization of shadows. Shadows. And what he means by that is that he says, he gives an illustration. He says, look at Japanese architecture. That when you look at architecture in the West, the architect in designing the building is thinking of how the building looks or will look. He says in Japan, the architect will think of what kind of shadows this building will cast. I mean, it's fantastic the way he actually sets about through little nuggets, right? Trying to create a sense of what constitutes Japanese civilization and the predominant register in which we may think about such a civilization. And this, it seems to me, is the kind of challenge that Professor Devi has put forward for us in his very intriguing, complex, and wonderful talk. Thank you.
Wonderful. So wonderful. So now we are more confused. So in the sense that now we have to figure it out, what really constitutes Indian civilization, whether it is linguistic based, language based, or is there a central character of it? All those things will come into question answer session. Before we move to question answer, just an announcement for coming week's event. Faisal? Obviously, it's a very different event that is coming. It is on Pathan movie, totally different concept. But this is one thing that is really has taken India by storm in last month. And to the point that Professor Muhammad Asim Siddiqui of Aligarh Muslim University is going to talk on the Pathan phenomena, especially in this today's world or today's India, where there is a cultural expression going on. So Pathan makes a big statement. And he will be supported by Professor Sarojit Mukherjee from Allahabad University, as well as from Bai Huma Parveen of Aligarh. So let's move on to question answer. Dr. Rafat Hussain is the moderator of this session, and he will be taking your questions and answers and questions for Devi and Vinay Lal. Rebecca has left because of some guests were coming. So thank you all. Over to Dr. Rafat Hussain.
Thank you, Razi Bhai. Before I open the question and answer session, I wanted to thank Professor Ganesh Devi for an intellectual analysis of the languages in India, and equally delightful concluding remarks by Professor Lal. And I like to thank Rebecca Roberts also in her absence. So the session is open for question and answer. You can raise your hand, a digital hand or a physical hand, or show your interest in the chat box. So I already have some comments in chat box, and I'm gonna to begin with Iram Gul. Iram Gul has 3 comments over there, so please be short in asking the question. Go ahead, please. Unmute yourself. Iram. Let me see, she's there. No, she has left, but I'm gonna to read her question if you don't mind. So she is asking, sir, what are the sources of ancient history and languages in India other than religious writings like Vedas, Puranas, and Arthashastras, etc., and Ashoka's inscription? And the next question she has, Sind is also called mother of all languages in India. Is it true? Please go ahead, Devi Saab.
Thank you. Grateful for the questions. The sources of language and linguistics for India uh, are scattered in Pali, Prakrit, in ancient modern languages like Tamil, classical modern languages like Odia, Marathi, and so on, and Kannada, of course. In Tamil, Tolkapiyam, which is a first century text, talks of language as a very fascinating definition of language is offered. It speaks, Tolkapiyam speaks of language as an inner landscape and an outer landscape. And the entire Tamil tradition of philosophy, literature, and Tamil spirituality, but also the power play in the Dravidic world are based on this description of language. There's some translation of this in Ramanujan, A.K. Ramanujan, The Interior Landscape, that is, I think, the title of a book. And Kamal Zwalbil, North European scholar, has translated this text into English. It's a very useful text for understanding how people prior to people who had settled in India prior to the advent of the Indus civilization in the south of India looked at language, but the attitude was articulated much later in history, only in the 1st century. In the Prakrit sources, there is a tremendous amount of a large wealth of discussion on what endows language, the narrative ability, communicative ability. In Sanskrit, apart from Panini, who is a non-religious fellow, I mean, he is not writing a religious text, but a scientific text. There is a man called Bhartrhari in the 4th century after Christ. Bhartrhari's definition of language is as follows. He says, meaning is a continuous stream, but words are like objects that we hold over that stream, and their reflections seen in the inside the stream appear to us as meaning of those objects, shadows of those objects. So in Bhartrhari's description of meaning, meaning is composed only of shadows, not of substance, but shadows whose foundation is substance. When not shadows, stand-alone shadows, but shadows of things, and which is a different way of looking at language. It is irrespective of the philosophies of the other world, philosophies of the spirit, and so on. That Bhartrhari, though Bhartrhari himself was conflicted between a Buddhist stream of philosophy and a Vedic stream of philosophy as a thinker, but his description of language goes way beyond both the Upanishadic thought and the Buddhistic thought.
Thank you very much.
Uh,
She has a following
Yes,
question,
I mean,
please.
I can go on. I can go
Yeah,
on.
I know. I
Sources.
know.
Hemachandracharya, of all, the most important 11th century man who comes between Sanskrit, Sindhi, and Gujarati and Marathi. I mean, he works in the interface of 4 languages, and he has a text called. He has a text which talks of language is. I mean, I am a fan of this man. Hemachandracharya says, and he's not Acharya in the sense of some religious guru or so. His own upbringing was Jainistic. He comes from Jain tradition. He says language, don't think language is there. All language is translation. It begins in translation, ends in translation. So he says, if you want to write a grammar, you must write a Desi Namamala. You must always write the bilingual meanings of words in order to even begin to talk, utter the word grammar. So there is a range of things with which I'm familiar, but there's a larger range of with which I'm not familiar.
Thank you. So I know you covered a little bit, but please say a few sentences. What are the reasons of so many languages born or evolved in Indian subcontinent? Whether it's a vast area or diverse geography. I know you covered it, but can say a few words about it.
It's a vast area and diverse geography. The Gondi language, the Gondi tribal language, has a take on what language is, and the Gondi language says that language is elongating shadows, shadows that grow longer. That is, they say that language begins in shadows of substance, but later shadows themselves become the substance of which there are shadows, when language becomes a tradition and a transgenerational affair. When language moves from one generation to the next generation does not require objects to be signified by words, but words themselves become objects to be inherited by the next generation. That is, a shadow becomes substance in that case, not becoming substance, but performs the functionality of substance, and it dismisses the need for substance. It's a fascinating way of looking at. And Gondi has a unfortunately not sufficiently published, but a rich trajectory, a rich repertoire of these thoughts written in verse. And those verses are still available in the community, some in the oral form, some in print now of late. I can mention about the Bhilli attitude to language, and that is Bhils believe, firmly believe, and absolutely nothing in the world can shake their belief that language is possible only as a picture that is completely shadowless. Their painting tradition called Pitora does not have shading as a device. It's a shadowless, it's a merciless clarity of the image that makes language what language is. It is like light, bright light, without any object in its arena, uh, potentially allowing a shadow to enter. So from the Gondi attitude of only shadows and nothing, no substance, to Billy attitude of only substance and no shadows, there's an entire spectrum of tribal thought on philosophy of language, which is waiting for attention. However, if you allow me just half a minute to return to the the very useful comment that Professor Vinelal offered on my crudely assembled thoughts, I would like to add to what I said that the talk of nationalism in India has a very short life. Whether that talk has an adjective such as Hindu nationalism or whatever, or nationalism in the name of unity, unitary nationalism, it shall not last amidst this kind of population which has inherited an emotional and cultural relationship with languages, and that's a great hope for us. The very best, the closest one can go to the idea of nationalism in India is, one can say, India is a union of languages, not unity of languages. That answers the second question on Hindi. Is it the oldest? Is it the largest? The answer is, it is not the oldest. It is the youngest among the modern Indian languages, because the name Hindi was used only when the government press came into existence, with Lalluji Lal appointed as the government officer to print books for the young trainees coming from England to rule as civil services officers. Prior to that, the names used were Audi, Khadiboli, and others. Surdas or Tulsidas or Kabir had not heard the term Hindi at all. The term Hindi or Hindavi was used by Ibn Battuta and Al-Baruni, but in both cases they were talking about a diversity of languages as Hindavi. For them, Hindavi was a linguistic way of Indians rather than name of a language. So Hindi is the youngest among the modern Indian languages, and whether it is pervasive in India, the answer is, in the census of 2011, 65 non-Hindi languages were pushed into the basket of Hindi to bolster up its, the number of speakers. It showed that 52 crores speak Hindi, but if you take out all the non-Hindi languages out of that the list, such as Bhojpuri, which was claimed by 5 crores, 3 lakhs, and so on, the total figure remains 38 crores, which is not much higher than 1/4 of Indian. That means 75% Indians do not claim, nearly 70% Indians do not claim Hindi as their mother tongue. And Hindi is a new language. It's a wonderful language. I love some of the Hindi writers, and it's simply fantastic. But it is larger than Malayalam and larger than Marathi, but does not mean is greater than Malayalam or greater than Marathi. The oldest language is Tamil, and it is a great language, but it does not mean it is greater than Hindi or Konkani. All languages, for Indians, all languages are at par, because all languages are playing out the game of transcending the substance and the shadow binary, and moving into a world which is very congenial to the things to come, and that is the virtual world, where substance and shadows merge or separate at will, and yet one does not cancel the other.
Thank you.
I'm saying that nationalism has a very short life in this civilization. And language has a very long life in our lives. And therefore, if we speak and we protect the freedom of speech and the freedom of expression, that will be the best resistance for any kind of totalitarian, autocratic state trying to submerge us, suppress us, drown us under its pressure through intimidation or fear. I think all this abstract, semi-philosophical, confusing thought I'm putting before you is a defense of expression without fear. Thank you.
Thank you. Devi Saab, your talk has generated a lot of questions, so please be careful when you answer them for long. So next person is Kaisar Naqvi Saab, and then Dayanandan and Rudrashru. So Kaisar Saab, please go ahead. Unmute yourself. And if he is not there, let me read his question. He is asking Ganesh Saab, if you may spare some thoughts on the origin of Urdu language and its development. Go ahead, please. Origin of Urdu language and its development.
The question of origin always pushes us into a chase, which is exciting in the beginning, but not sufficiently exciting as we go along. The origin is a question where this idea of time with a specific beginning, growth, and so on. Languages as cultural systems do not have a birth date. Recently, the government of India wanted to decide the precise birth date of Lord Krishna. And Deccan, the Bhandarkar Institute was asked to convene a seminar. And I happened to be in Pune, and I said to one of my friends there that, do you want, because Krishna was considered an avatar, a rebirth, do you want the birth date of the Krishna as we know, or previous birth, or yet previous birth? With the question of Urdu, one school of thought says that it emerged in the Gulbarga area, which is now in Karnataka, previously in the Nizam state, in a camp of soldiers, Turkish, Arabic, Persian-speaking soldiers without women, because they were warring in the south, and therefore the great etiquette associated with the nazakat associated with Urdu is explained. This is one school of. There's another which speaks of origin of Urdu in central India, the Uttar Pradesh, and both these have equal degree of equal amount of validation by way of text produced in the two. But when was Urdu spoken in the bazaar? That's a question that is yet to be fully answered. And because it is not fully answered, when Urdu was spoken by laborers or farmers, because that question is not sufficiently well answered, we are still not able to account for the Dakhani spoken in Telangana area, or Dakhani spoken in Aurangabad, in Maharashtra, and so on. And somehow it is shown as language spoken by lower people, wage earning people, illiterate people, and so on. Also, the precise border lines between Hindi and Urdu, whether they are border lines created by scripts or by only terminology saturation, or there's a pure grammatical border between the two, that also has not been fully explained, giving rise to confusion and wrong attacks on Urdu being Hindi. If Hindi is used by Muslims, it becomes this is sheer stupidity. But those positions are popularly taken because we have not looked at all Indian languages as a single field. And though there is a theory of Imanu has spoken of India as a linguistic area, but we've not seen all Indian languages together and describe them as I'm using this term civilization because I cannot think of another term to put across the comprehensive picture. If we had the ability to describe all Indian languages comprehensively at one go, then we will have a much greater clarity on the origin and the growth of Urdu vis-a-vis Hindi, vis-a-vis Persian, vis-a-vis Kannada and Telugu. I think this much I can say in the present situation of great uncertainties surrounding the question of Urdu. Thank you.
Thank you. Dayanandan Saab.
Oh, my question is there.
Yeah,
It
you want me
mostly
to?
has to do, yeah, you can read that the idea is to, concepts of zero, etc., sunya, are they also informed by this large linguistic survey of all languages spoken by all groups that you have studied?
Well, when I use the idea of zero, I had intended an element of slight irony. That is, while I respect the Brahmadatta's use of zero, giving its its first millennium after Christ, I am sick of the claims made of India's contribution to knowledge and science by putting forward fake candidates. And so this great pride in India having contributed zero. Of course, there are many stories related to zero. And there were attempts in different parts of the world. Some of the journeys were half finished, some were complete. And then there is the recognition that one such journey brings in zero. The idea of absence, idea of shadow, much precede historically the actual positioning of zero as a place name and also as an abstraction, both at the same time. I mean, Brahmadatta's unique talent was to think of a sign which can also be a representation of a concrete, such as place name, and also as an abstraction. But this zero, I mean, I was using the idea of zero not to sum up what the Gondis and the Bhils and the Santals and the Hindus and the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews and the Sikhs of India know. I wanted to get closer to their collective relationship with the absence of a tangible material token to represent meaning and yet manage to make meaning work. I will have to think of proper terminology to come to that. But I thought this, by using the concept of zero, I could open the mouth of a tiger, which someday will consume me. And yet somebody has to do that, to count precisely how many teeth the tiger has.
Thank you.
And that's why I consciously use the term. I will put this rather crude and tentative hypothesis before you for your consideration.
Well, it
I'm
just
saying
seemed as
much,
though the idea was more Sanskritic than any other and even earlier languages.
Thank you.
yes, 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 yes. But If I use, if I take recourse to Sanskrit scholarship, it is not necessary to endorse the claims in favor of that scholarship or all of it, not also to dismiss all of it as trivial, because even if our contemporaries are sinning against that tradition, it does not mean that we can take away from that tradition all its credit. But I was referring to it because I thought that in the university places where friends present for this discussion are, the libraries are richer in these textbooks. And if I had stuck only to my Billy or Gondi sources, you would think of me as a curious anthropological being. Having spent about 20 years living with the Adivasis, I'm much tempted to present only the Adivasi worldview. But I do not want to be more sound more obscure than I already have been when I'm trying to present these ideas. These are struggles in my mind, influenced by Ramanujan, influenced by Dharmanand Kosambi, by Ambedkar, and so on. I mean, as to what is caste, what is truth, what is God. And I am terrified at the answers I have arrived at, and I sometimes think that I might disturb people's sleep. Spoke. I think. I think I'm saying. I know. So I was trying to place myself across as a more acceptable animal. Thank you.
Thank you
Thank
so
you,
much.
sir. Thank you.
Okay, next is Rudranshu Singh and Satyanath Saab, and after that Shrikant Chopra. So please, Professor Devi Saab.
Please allow me to be very brief in answering this question.
That's what I requested you. I requested you earlier.
If the question is very interesting, then
Yeah,
but
please.
I
So
will be
please
I
be
will try
brief.
to be brief. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, because we have only a few minutes left. And
Sir,
Jabbar Saab, be ready for a 2-minute comment.
Sir, my question is that why Hindi could not become a national language, and is it lacking grammar, and why the 3-language formula which was designed in the 50s and 60s to make the North Indians learn Tamil and the South Indians, or especially the Tamils, learn Hindi, why that attempt failed?
हिंदी राष्ट्रभाषा नहीं बन सकी क्योंकि हिंदी के बारे में जितना. Is it okay if I speak Hindi?
Yeah, that's fine. Wow, for Jabbar Saab, please permit.
That's fine.
हिंदी के
Okay,
बारे
you
में.
can speak in mix. Go ahead, please.
Okay, I mean, those who are enthusiastic about Hindi, they are sinning against the language more than sinned against, because their enthusiasm towards Hindi often comes across as an attempt to hide and conceal the increasing unemployment in the Hindi belt, as an attempt to hold a carrot to the youth in those states by showing that, look, we're promoting Hindi. While not all Hindi promoters are politically motivated, but a majority of them are motivated by false pride and falsified data. And while that language is a beautiful language, it's not the question of grammar. Every language has its own grammar. No two grammars may be similar. But because it is a beautiful language, but it is not the Hindi that is at fault. It is the Hindi walas who are at fault. Thank you.
Very good. Satyanath Saab, please, you have so many comments over there, so please be brief. and merge your all questions in a couple of sentences. Go ahead, please.
There are different things, so I don't know if I can merge. But
Yeah,
my first question,
but Satynath Sahab, remember, give the chance to others also.
yeah, okay. I'm familiar with terms like Aztec civilization, Western civilization, Harappan civilization, mostly associated with sort of the place where those people live or those languages are spoken, those people live. Now, in that sense, linguistic civilization, what does it connote? Like, what does it really mean?
There was a 13th century Marathi poet and thinker. He used a very eloquent phrase. His name was Gnaneshwar. This phrase was "Iye Marathichi Nagari." The English translation is "in this city of Marathi." He imagined language as a city. I mention this because the term civilization, as in Latin, is about cities. And unless there is a city, a large city, dominating city, which has developed its own style in ancient history, the term civilization was not used. In 19th century, European historians used term civilization for Egypt, Mesopotamia, Assyrian, Indian civilization, but not with each and every part of the world.
In that sense,
the Greek civilization and Latin, yes. So yes, so
in that
civilization,
sense,
yes.
in that sense, a multilingual civilization would be more appropriate than calling it a linguistic civilization, wouldn't it be?
Yeah, I concede. Thank you.
Thank
In
you.
fact, this is precisely the comment that Ram Goa one day made to me when I was talking about him, talking with him about some of these ideas. So how two great minds think alike.
Thank you, Devi Saab, for your patience. Couple more minutes. Shri Kant Chopra Saab. Let me see if he's there.
Yes, I'm here. Let me give me.
Go ahead, please.
So my question more of a comparative observation between the European landscape and Indian subcontinent. And do you think that the homogeneity, which is a little bit more in European languages in terms of development of languages versus in the Indian subcontinent, what are the reasons for those? And is there a role of Christianity as a unifying force in Europe and also at the same time a regressive force for the language diversity? And it's a very general question, but I thought I'll ask you a question anyway. Thank you.
Thank you. The European powers, European people, as they moved from mid 18th century, actually from the times of Descartes, but more from mid 18th century till our times, have come together on one assumption, and that is the source of energy is the magnet for development. That is, people move closer to the source of energy. All migrations are seen as moving to the source of energy. Now that energy is as material energy. But if one had to think of source of instinct, impulse, I will not use the term intuition, which is purely mental, but a move, an action, an act, whether it is of compassion, of commitment, of clarification, of confusion, or even of conflict. So, if civilization, if development were to be seen as migration towards, attraction towards, not energy but impulse, which is also one of the triggers for development, then I think we people are much different from the European people. But I do not want to set this binary between Europe and us, Orient and Occident. That Europe, as you know far better, sir, than I do, is such a diverse place. And I wish I had the expertise to comment on the entire history and the entire people of Europe. I I went down the path of talking about Indian people because I happen to have I was fortunate to get close to so many hundreds of Indian languages through that People's Linguistic Survey of India. And it's like counting, because I found dollars, I was counting dollar currency. If I had found euro currency, I would be counting euro currency. It's a sheer matter of chance that I'm speaking of India, because I thought if I did not speak about the civilizational contribution of language, somebody else speaking about it may take some time and things may have to wait for a long time. That's why my impatience based on imperfect knowledge. Thank you.
Thank you. A quick comment from Abdul Jabbar Saab and then Ravi Saab. That's it.
Okay. So, Ravi sir, do you want to go first? Because there's a 0 there.
Yeah, sorry to put you on his Ravi Saab, I'm sorry to put you on his spot.
Yeah, it's a discussion on 0.
Well, I kind of out of depth, so
Just a moment, sir. Let me say goodbye to Vinay. And
Oh, yeah,
Vinay,
sure.
Yeah,
see you
let him
very
laugh.
soon.
Yeah,
He's
let him
about to leave.
Thank you so much, Professor Lal. It was wonderful
Thank you for having
concluding.
Yeah.
I see.
We are finishing in a couple of minutes. Thank you.
no, well, I don't know whether I can express my confusion in a couple of minutes or not, but let me just say that, I mean, we worry about, often we ask questions in India about, especially the activist lot, what keeps India together? And one answer comes that a state has kept India together, but a state has been, all India state has been missing most of the time in Indian history. There are very few empires which were all India. And then modern state, which is all India is too young. So the hand waving answer comes that, okay, there is something called Indian civilization that keeps India together and forces people to imagine India as a nation. Now, Professor Devi says that India is a linguistic civilization, and languages, as he would know better than anyone else, that there are hundreds or maybe thousands of languages. So I am back into square one. How do I understand what keeps India together? Because, I mean, if there are, the civilization is being defined by languages and languages are too many, then what keeps India together? And seems to me that he's stating or he's claiming that, let us devise this term called linguistic civilization. That does not solve the problem. It may be just a term, a concept, maybe a word game, but that doesn't do away with hundreds of languages that are there. Or despite hundreds of languages, India manages to stay together. Let me just add one more point, that Professor Devi seems to respect counterfactuals or data, as he moved away from earlier thesis based on Rajasthan having 44 languages. Now, there are counterfactuals to what he seems to be saying. For example, there used to be a linguistic state called Andhra Pradesh. Now that is two, Telangana and Andhra Pradesh. And who knows, soon enough, the rest of Andhra Pradesh will be, coastal Andhra and Rayalaseema. So there will be three linguistic states in one language. other counterfactual I will call is I am a Bihari. Bhojpuri is my mother tongue, and my mother tongue is spread across two states, northwestern Bihar and eastern UP. And in fact, purest Bhojpuri is spoken in a district which falls in UP and not in Bihar, which is Balia, Banaras Balia region, and Bhojpur happens to be in Bihar. So these are other kind of counterfactuals that, even if you take, if you take Bhojpuri out, as Professor Devi was saying, it is not only 5 crores are taken out of Hindi, then you will have to take Awadhi out, Braj Bhasha out, many languages out, Maithili out, so Hindi will not be left, but I will not get into that problem. My point is just to make this counterfactual that one linguistic state was is divided into 2 and maybe divided into 3 in the case of Telugu. And my mother tongue, Bhojpuri, if you consider that as a language, then it is spread across 2 states. So I do not know where your argument stands in face of these counterfactuals. But my main question is that by declaring that India is a linguistic civilization, do you think you have answered why India stays together?
Thank you. If I were to just imagine the constitution slightly differently drafted, I would imagine, and I'm only saying I would imagine, I'm not asking for, I would imagine the sentence India is a union of states to be the sentence that India is a union of languages. And instead of the schedule for languages, I would imagine schedule for states. Because in the schedule, you can add more names. But in the definition, you cannot add another definition. India is together because it is a union, and that I say union very conscious, does not mean unity. Unity has one as the basis. Foundation is one. The ideal is to be one. Union, the term union allows many as the basis. And the ideal is to allow the many to be there as being together. India is a union of languages. And therefore, it is a people or peoples, a way of life, an existence, which is a language. I'm not, when I say language, I do not mean a language, but languages, all languages, which languages determine far more deeply than one tends to normally accept. I stopped there. I also stopped there because, quite frankly, I had a very long day out in these small villages in Western India today. And I think...
Thank you so much, Devi Saab. Finale comment by Jabbar Saab in few sentences, please.
Yes, I think my comment is a fantastic discussion. I appreciated that. I have some sort of indirect connection to Professor Ubay Siddiqui. Ubay Siddiqui was recruited by mentor, PhD mentor from Harvard to come to TA Fort Bombay. Then he came to Madurai Kamaraj. I became a student. That connection, congratulations, you have the chair. I was so excited about
He is only the chair of the name. He hardly knows.
I know. I mean, I think
He has no connection.
because I could have really talked a little more about other things, but it's a time.
Later.
Yeah, later. Yes.
Yeah, because
Thank you. Great.
Great. Back to you.
I think he's
back to you, and please, because
Professor. I think it was very wonderful talk, wonderful discussion, and he has raised so many serious issues and very, very thoughtful, concept that is going on. Especially Devi Saab in the in the present moment, when there is a thirst on one culture, one language, one kind of dominance of one thing, and you are promoting a thought, it seems that it runs very much deep counter to that concept, and this is very good. This is very good. So long people like you are promoting such concepts, there are many others to think and follow about it. It's very late, and sorry for that, but you really opened up our minds and maybe a little heart and to think and rethink about it. And it's wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank
Let
you,
me
Professor
thank you.
Devi. Thank you so much. I wish there was more time and I would have heard from Professor Mukherjee or some other learned people here, but sorry about that.
Yeah, Aditya Mukherjee is,
Aditya
Let me thank
Mukherjee
you
Sahib
for
is there.
asking me to be with you. And I can assure you on the basis of my inadequate understanding of history, life, and philosophy that this myopic nationalism has no future. Thank you and good night.
we believe so, and we pray for its demise. Okay, thank you.